Hello, this is John Burroughs again, and I'm going to continue with my autobiography, 7 Years to Life. This is chapter 62, and it's called March 11th, 1981, the first day at Pacific Bell. I was hired on at Pacific Bell to be a pay telephone installer, title, service tech. It could be considered one of the most fortuitous days of my life, though I did not know it at the time. I was distraught because I applied to Pacific Bell, but I did because I was constantly being encouraged to do so by my brother and mother. Sometimes people are perplexed when it is not the compensation you receive at work or the long hours worked each week in order to receive said compensation, but rather it is the vibe, so to speak. Your importance to a small business relative to a giant corporation and the external family that you've become a part of. When I reminisce today about those times, the only reason that I do not regret moving on is the fact that I found Christina there. If she could have been mine and I could have continued to work there, then I would have done just that in a heartbeat. Driving to work that day, I thought to myself more than once that I should turn around and go back to 42nd Avenue Shell. It was much later in my career that I was thankful that I never followed through on that decision. I reported to my job location in Redwood City and met my peers and my manager. The first day was spent riding with my manager, Hank H., who gave me his special tour in philosophy about working at Pacific Bell. Hank H. was not what I had thought my first boss would turn out to be. Appearance-wise, he looked like a greasy car mechanic or a character out of the movie Deliverance. The first day he drove me up into the San Bruno Hills to see his home, and at the risk of being cruel, it was unimpressive, but he was proud of it, and that is what really mattered. The rest of the day he told me stories about himself that you knew were at least 75% bullshit. Then he took me to the nearest central office and showed me around. I think that was more for show because he knew many people there, and he enjoyed that many of those people would stop and chat with him. The ones that didn't choose to socialize with him because they already knew how desperate he was to be considered cool by both men and women, and this made them uncomfortable just as it made a lot of other employees feel the same way. I decided to write this story because Hank was possibly the most misunderstood person I had ever known. The way he acted was beyond his control. He came from a time and culture that political correctness was a term that had not been thought of yet. He had this insatiable need to be accepted, to be part of the in crowd. His desire to be cool was the impetus that led to so much of his bullshit. The lies were pretty much endless. He was going to be an Olympic weightlifter until he hurt his back. He was married at 16 years old and supposedly always had women problems because of the vast numbers of women that just found him irresistible. He owned a service station when, in actuality, his daughter's boyfriend worked the night shift there. He had offered to fix people's car problems, however, it always had to be at night due to his job at Pacific Bell. There were many other stories where the evidence presented a compelling argument against their authenticity. I do not know much about his upbringing, but he always called people babe, male or female. And I remember others of his generation had that habit and similar others. He grew up in a generation where women's liberation and equal opportunity employment were still relatively new terms. This was a generation where men constantly flirted with women using compliments, most of them respectful, and others that slightly stepped over the line, and the women of his generation invited them. The culture had been pervasive for decades, and then the changes of a new generation were happening so fast that people like Hank had a very hard time making the individual changes to keep up with the times, and that eventually was his downfall. He went from success story to tragedy within 3 or 4 years. The teenager married at 16 with only a GED diploma went from an entry-level position to a management position at Pacific Bell in a relatively short time. He was very proud of that, and justifiably so. There was another side of Hank, and that was the side that he showed when others were in trouble, whether minor or major. As the saying goes, he would give you the shirt off his back, if necessary, to help you. This side of Hank was genuine and had nothing to do with his need to be accepted. As women became more prominent in the workplace and began doing jobs that traditionally for so many years were jobs held exclusively by men, such as lineman, or now line person, Hank could not break his old habits acquired over a lifetime of acceptance quick enough. If you ever have watched the TV series Mad Men, then you understand the culture that Hank was raised in, and it did not matter whether you were a rich man or a poor man, you were a man. This new generation would be his downfall, and his desire for acceptance and the habits he had developed over a lifetime overcame his ability to change in an expedient enough way to save his employment. This time, when Hank had women in his crew under his supervision, instinctively he would flirt and call them babe, just like he called me and the other guys in the crew babe. He would tell the women that they looked pretty, or he liked the way their hair looked that day, or he would say it in a simple, genuine way, not in a lecherous way. Some women filed complaints, and this caused Hank to lose his managerial position, and he was busted back to a technician. Unfortunately, the new rules apply to all employees, not only managers. The complaints brought on suspensions, and you could see it in Hank's eyes and the way he carried himself that, try as he might, he could not adjust to the new environment. The straw that broke the camel's back was a complaint brought by this vindictive bee that was the epitome of a double standard. I honestly believe that sexual harassment complaints that were brought against Hank were not because of the things he said, because, if I'm being honest, his appearance was very unappealing. It became a witch hunt, and I firmly believe that many of the accusations that followed of improper contact were flat-out lies, especially in the final case that caused his termination. Here is how I know. After you get to know a person for a long enough period of time, you know what they are capable of doing and not doing. Hank would never have the guts to touch anyone sexually unless without a doubt there was an explicit invitation to do so. It was not in his DNA. Secondly, the girl that accused him of making sexual statements and advancements toward her did not seem to mind this young, handsome, muscular guy that worked in the control center that did the same thing that Hank did, but he did it in a more suggestive, lewd, and lascivious manner. I had happened to be in a position to overhear and watch the whole thing. Funny, she did not file any sort of complaint against him. The sad thing is, I could have filed a complaint on the basis of what I had heard and witnessed that day, and I didn't. I regret that deeply to this day because I have an extreme dislike for those double standard types that believe certain people should act in a certain way, but do not hold themselves to the same standard. Listen, I consider myself a champion for women. They deserve equal pay for equal work. In fact, the higher paying positions were not even offered to women for a long time, and they are still waging a war that may be endless against the many good old boy networks that still exist today. Women have made unbelievable strides in the past 50 years against overwhelming odds, and history should never let that be forgotten. I think as a society we have become too thin-skinned. Political correctness is just a tool used by some to stop the truth from being told. It is time to reverse the tide and lighten up a little. There will always be injustices that need to be fought, but in my opinion, a little understanding and a hell of a lot more humor would go a long way in covering injustice and prejudice. Hank was just an insecure man, starved for attention and acceptance. He was dealt a lot of bad hands in his life, and he did not have the logic or understanding in order to play them correctly. His personality was eccentric and vastly misunderstood, and for that he got shafted. He was a kind man that trusted people too much and made mistakes that he did not have the time to rectify. Here's to Hank. I understood and was always in your corner.